Discover Geography, Lesson 5, Environmental Justice. If you spend any amount of time looking at how human society interact with the natural environment, you'll run into frequent claims of environmental injustice. People claiming that there's something unfair about the way our society interacts with the environment. Here you see a few examples. People claim that it's unfair that certain types of industry or waste disposal are occurring in certain locations. People saying it's unfair how our food system works. People arguing that it's unfair who gets to control which lands. In this next series of lessons, we're going to be looking at the nature of some of these claims so that we can understand what the basis for these claims are and so that you have the tools to analyze them to determine whether you think these are valid claims or not. And if you do think they're valid, what might be done to resolve the injustice. The contemporary concern with environmental injustice is a product of the environmental justice movement, which got its start in the 1980s, focusing specifically on the issue of environmental racism. Environmental racism is environmental injustices in which particular racial groups are unfairly targeted, in which certain racial groups have unequal access to the good things in the environment and the bad things. One of the key early events that helped launch the environmental justice movement was the controversy over the construction of a toxic waste dump in Warren County, North Carolina. Here you see a picture of some protesters in Warren County in the early 1980s opposing the construction of this waste dump. And they were opposed to the waste dump not just because they didn't want to live next to a place where PCBs and other hazardous materials were being disposed, but because they believed that this was specifically a racially unequal waste dump. This was a waste dump that was being built in the portion of the county that had a much higher African American population than the other parts of the county or of some of the surrounding counties. Here you see the location of that waste dump superimposed on a map of the racial composition of this area of North Carolina. And not only is the waste dump in a predominantly African American area, but it's actually right next door to a church that was attended by African Americans from throughout the county. So the protesters believed that the construction of this waste dump was not just something they didn't like, but that it was an injustice, that it was creating racial inequality in access to a clean environment for the people of Warren County, North Carolina. In this particular case, the protests were unsuccessful and the waste dump ended up getting built. But following this, we saw similar protests all around the country as people began to point out that in many parts of the country, it seemed like all of the bad things in the environment, polluting industry, waste dumps, etc., seemed to always be located in neighborhoods with high proportions of people of color and not located in neighborhoods that were largely white. And as people began to network over this issue, this formed a nationwide and ultimately worldwide movement around the issue of environmental injustice. It was at this point that academic researchers come into the picture. Once the environmental justice movement was making enough of an impact on our national consciousness, academic researchers were able to set out to try to validate some of the claims that were being made. People are saying that pollution and hazardous waste dumps and industry are disproportionately located in communities of color. That's something that we can do research to verify, to see whether that claim is actually accurate in a particular case or as a general rule nationwide. And what's been found through this research is that the claims of the environmental justice movement actually do check out. When we look nationwide, we find that neighborhoods surrounding toxic waste dumps, polluting factories, and other sorts of bad environmental institutions have much higher proportions of people of color in their populations than do neighborhoods that are farther away from these polluting sites. We also find that the neighborhoods closer to these polluting sites tend to have a higher proportion of poor people than do neighborhoods farther away. And we also find that the racial disparity continues to be present even after we control for the economic disparity. That is, it's not simply the case that there are more black people and Hispanic people living next to toxic waste sites simply because black people and Hispanic people are on average poorer than white people. Even when we compare people of different races at the same economic level, if we compare, say, middle-class black people to middle-class white people, the middle-class black people are more likely to be living in a neighborhood with a toxic site than are the middle-class white people. So thus far, the concerns of the environmental justice movement seem to be very consonant with the concerns of the mainstream environmental movement. Both of these movements are concerned about pollution. Both of them want to try to eliminate the impacts of pollution on both humans and the natural environment. But as the environmental justice movement began to grow, it also began to criticize the mainstream environmental movement. It began to point out ways in which efforts at protecting nature, efforts at achieving environmental conservation, can themselves have unjust impacts. One of the first things that was pointed out is that the membership, and especially the leadership, of mainstream environmental groups, groups like the Sierra Club or the Wilderness Society, tended to be disproportionately white, middle class, and male. This indicates, first of all, an issue as to why people of color, poorer people, women, are not able to move up within these organizations and become people in positions of power. And furthermore, if your organization has a mostly middle-class white male leadership, then the issues your organization is going to attempt to address, the specific environmental problems that are going to be at the top of your organization's agenda, are not necessarily going to be the same as the problems that are of greatest importance to people who are not like the leadership, communities of color, poorer people. The environmental justice movement also pointed out that many of the tactics used by mainstream environmental groups perpetuated other injustices. And many mainstream environmental groups have been so focused on trying to achieve certain environmental outcomes, certain types of conservation outcomes, that they would pursue those goals in ways that undermined other types of social justice. So here you see an example of a pro-environmentalist ad. You can see it's labeled "Hot Chicks Dig Dudes Who Hug a Tree." So in this case, this ad is pursuing an environmental goal, trying to get people to be more conservationist, to preserve and plant trees, but it's doing it in a way that perpetuates sexism, that perpetuates the idea that women's sexuality is kind of a reward that can be given to men who do the right thing. So in this case, we have a group pursuing one goal at the expense of another type of justice. And one major issue where the environmental justice movement and the mainstream environmental movement have butted heads is over the preservation of wilderness areas. Preservation of wilderness has been a major agenda item for many mainstream environmental groups for a century. These groups want to take areas that have very little human presence, very little human impact on them, and set them aside to be natural areas and to maintain that low level of human impact. But when we look at the different wilderness areas that have been created around the United States and around the world, what we find is that most of those areas had been inhabited by people in the past. So in order to turn them into wilderness areas, in order to turn them into areas with no human presence or only temporary human presence from things like hikers passing through, those previous human inhabitants had to be excluded, had to be removed in some way. So throughout the western United States, most of our wilderness areas and national parks had been inhabited by Native Americans who were removed either prior to establishment of the wilderness area as a result of the various Indian wars and genocides that occurred, or in some cases were actually kicked out of that area in order to make it into a national park or a wilderness area. In the eastern United States, we see many examples where not only were Native Americans removed from those areas far in the past, but poor white settlers who had lived in those areas were subsequently kicked out in order to turn it into a national park. If we look abroad, as the mainstream environmental movement expanded its wilderness agenda to try to establish wilderness areas and national parks in other parts of the world, we find in places like Africa and Asia that areas were set aside as parks, and so therefore the local people who had used those areas as part of their subsistence, grazing cattle in them, for example, as you see in the picture, had to be removed from those areas, had to be forbidden from continuing to make use of those areas in order to turn it into this nature preserve. The environmental justice movement claims that this is unjust, not only because people are being deprived of their land, being deprived of their traditional livelihood, but also because those people had been using these lands in a sustainable way. They had not been harming the land by continuing to do things like graze their cattle there. And so it was doubly unfair that they were being kicked out. So we can see from this example that claims of environmental injustice are typically very controversial. They're opposed by other groups who will argue that the alleged injustice is not, in fact, an injustice, that it's the right thing to do. So we'll see environmental groups claiming that creating wilderness areas is the right thing to do, even if it requires excluding people who had lived in that area in order to protect nature. And so the goal of this set of lessons is to help you to analyze situations like this so that you can determine who's right and who's wrong. Is this an injustice or is it actually just? And what kind of argument or case can you make to support your point of view in order to try to convince people who disagree with you to change their minds?